I'd like to welcome everybody to the fifth class of the Progress in Poverty here in Manhattan, New York, at the Midtown location of the Henry George School of Social Science. My name is Marty Rowland. I'm the chair of the Education Committee for the board of the Henry George School. So we're going to be going for about 90 minutes or so, give or take. I did want to start out the meeting tonight. Actually, I wanted to remind everybody who is in the live in the class or watching it on YouTube or in the archived version eventually, that the slides for tonight's presentation are on the website, www.hgsss.org. And I'll be reading out the slide number that I'm on because the video that you're seeing doesn't include the slides. So you just go to the website, open up the slides and follow along. So before we get started, I wanted to show you something that was in the New York Times. I read the New York Times pretty much every day. October 27th, Saturday, talking about private equity firms getting into the dermatology field. So the case is about private equity firms finding a good market to dominate and charge high fees to the Medicaid. And I think we all agree in the Georgist movement that markets are good for establishing proper private economic activity. But in some cases, we see that it's driving to monopoly. So either at the end of today's meeting with people who are live or people want to email questions in or archive, you can let us know. But I want to just people to think about this sentence, and we'll probably come back to it at the end of today's meeting. But somebody was complaining about the private equity firms, and he says, I realize we live in a capitalist society and money is a driving force behind many decisions regardless of the industry. However, I believe there has to be a balance between profit and patient care. There's a lot of George's material embedded in that little article I just read, and maybe we can talk about that. That issue is going to be coming up in the lecture today. So today what I've got is a repeat of of many of the slides we saw when I was teaching the first and second class. I'm not going to dwell on those. I've got like 30 slides that kind of orient you to what Henry George is talking about and some of the things. But I did want to make some observations before we start, because I think it's key to understanding Progress in Poverty, which is the premier book that Henry George wrote 140 years ago next year in 1879. So my observation is that the original text of Progress in Poverty continues to be relevant in the 21st century. We see that rent is still impoverishing many people, wealth is not equitably distributed, social maladjustments crop up continually, with few pinpointing the primary wrong, the inequitable distribution of wealth. Just as 140 years ago, socially created land value needed to go toward social adjustments, which is infrastructure and services to the community, to keep the cooperative, I call the flywheel, because Henry George uses a lot of analogies, and he does talk about flywheels. But I see it as a way of identifying the economy as a way that he was trying to describe it. But I call it a cooperative flywheel spinning. Markets do not always optimize community wealth, and that's what Henry George was getting at in Progress in Poverty. It's all about community wealth. And so I will have to say that he does make a point that free competition is the underlying principle of a science of political economy, the basis of a private economy. Although unstated by Henry George, I would like to point out that He stood on the shoulders of giants who understood community wealth. And I'll just throw this out, that the 16th through the 19th century German the German cameralists, who were financial advisors to leaders in Central Europe, had theoretical contributions from other thinkers, but they were always talking about infrastructure, having the ready means for those things that a nation needs, like security, water, and other things. So I just wanted to point that out as an observation that I'm making with the idea of cooperation, community. So I say that progress and poverty is also relevant today, and any properly schooled Georgia should be able to articulate a corrective policy before, during, and after the next financial crisis by asking 6 questions. And I bring this up because Georgia's missed a great opportunity in 2007, 2008 when we had a financial crisis and everybody was looking for policy suggestions, and I didn't hear any. But I just want to say that any properly schooled Georgia should be able to answer these questions and maybe give some advice. What is and what is not wealth? Why isn't it equitably distributed? And the word equitably distributed, it's not equally distributed, but with equity. Who is benefiting from spurious capital and profits mistaken for interest? This is relevant for the 2007 and 8 crisis. What does the community need? What do we owe the speculator? And when we think about bailing out banks, perhaps we should be talking about debt jubilees like they did in old days. So those are some things to think about, and I just wanted to throw it out. Might generate some discussion online and such. So let me go into let me describe that. What I have today is 71 slides, and I told you that 30 of the beginning ones are like the introduction. I'm going to go through and highlight some of the big one, the big meaning slides. So that means I got about 41 slides, going to spend about 2 minutes per slide on average, but it'll go kind of quick. So we'll hold questions till the end, and then maybe we can sit around and have some coffee. So the introduction and the teaching tools. I brought this up in the first and second class, that there is a YouTube video recording today and the first 4 classes. You have to go to the Henry George School website, that's www.hgsss.org, to get the slides. So I'm asking people to read Progress and Poverty, the assignment for each time. Now, I did want to point out that I came up with this term, intellectual gutter talk, in the first and second classes. It's the kind of talk that Henry George says, this is how the powers that be try to fool you. So I think it's a useful term. It's got a little bit more punch than what Henry George was getting at. So by the end of the lecture today, it'll be obvious that the new intellectual gutter term is called labor productivity. Now, if you think about that phrase, it's often used in economic writing. You probably read it 10 times in the most recent issue of The Economist. And the point that I'm trying to make is that Henry George has a problem with that terminology because of what it implies. But we'll get to that in a second. So we're going to talk about chapters 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 today. This is the second half of the book 3 on the laws of distribution of wealth. And today is October 31st, Halloween night. And if you fall asleep, I think Freddy Krueger is going to wake you up. So this is a good way to open any of these classes, because this is the introduction to Progress and Poverty. He was saying that 19th century saw great increases in wealth, and wealth productive processes. So the production scale and subdivision increased, efficiency of labor increased. Shouldn't the benefits go to labor? That was a big question. And he was always interested in labor. You might recall that he ran for mayor of New York City in 1886 on the United Labor Party, so there's shouldn't be any doubt where his sympathies lied. An immense wedge is forced through society, he made the point, not underneath it where you might lift people up. And he said that poverty with progress is a great enigma of our times. So that's a good starting point. Now, I'm not going to go through all the slides here. And demagogues, the people that were promoting a different brand of economics. And he said something like, some people say that interest should be abolished. And if you understand what Henry George was getting at, what interest is, that's absurd. Also, it's the duty of government to furnish capital or work. And we know that Henry George was died in the rural capitalist, even though he had a very radical idea about the distribution of wealth, more radical than a lot of people today would find comfortable. So he says that the political economy is not a set of dogmas. It lays the foundation upon firm ground. That's what he's doing with the Progress and Poverty. Well, what is political economy? He has this phrase, and I'm going to be bringing it up again and again. It's called "Men seek to gratify their desires with the least exertion," and because of that principle that he says is as common as gravitation for objects falling off of tables and things. And he puts that to good use, and he repeats it over and over. In fact, you'll see that I've got an acronym for that phrase. So this is something that Henry George said, all the result of natural law. This is what he was promoting. Harder times, lower wages, higher rates of poverty. It's like gravitation. But humans can intervene on laws of nature by creating institutions, social adjustments that I suggest bend society toward justice. So if you read Henry George and you don't get that he's for social justice, then you're not reading it correctly. Ending poverty is an example of bending society toward justice. And I just want to point out that in the title of Progress and Poverty, he calls this book The Remedy for industrial depressions and the increase of want with increased wealth. So how you solve that problem, solving poverty. So what he's laying out is the remedy. So if you're not schooled in Progress and Poverty, you may not grasp what that remedy is. And it's important to realize that this book came out 5 years after the start of an economic depression. It was the first worldwide depression, so might explain the popularity of the book. So he's not writing a textbook. He's attempting to discover the laws which control great social problems. I'm on slide number 11 right now, just running through the first 30 slides here. And I mentioned earlier in this talk that George speaks from a community perspective, and this is on pages 40 and 44, slide number 12. And importantly, he says, stopping inequality does not make wealth equally distributed, but there would be a better chance that it could be. So he's not forcing anything. He was saying, let's stop the inequality, and perhaps we can get better times after that. He was a total opponent to aggregate wealth, and I'm going to be bringing this up today because it gets in, well, we get into chapter 4 on spurious capital. There may be relative wealth in a community, yet a few drops of ink could be utterly annihilated, this wealth. And he's talking about wealth that might be expectations of wealth, could be things like mortgages, other things that indebtedness. And this is a phrase that I made up, that Henry George makes socialism superfluous, And I think if we all wore T-shirts around the election day, people would say, "What the hell is that about?" And it might spur some questions and maybe attendance here, because it's not generally thought about. Henry George, this guy 140 years ago.
Excuse me, I just want to ask something.
I'm sorry?
Wasn't Henry George poor?
When was he born?
Poor.
Poor. P-O-O-R.
He wasn't a wealthy man.
Oh, he was impoverished a lot of the time. But let me get through the slides and then we'll.
I'm just curious.
Okay, chapter 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then we're going to do a segue to book number 4 that we have for the next class. And I don't have my syllabus in front of me, but I think it's 2 weeks later. But somebody can correct me before we finish that. But the syllabus is online as well. And I talked about the intellectual gutter talk. I'm introducing a new term. I'm going to be talking about the Hope Crisis Continuum because it is exhibited in the reading today. So these were some of the intellectual gutter talk things that we talked about prior. Wages coming from capital, supply of labor due to the demand for labor. He talks about that in the readings today. And profits being conflated with interest. It's a very loaded term, profits, because it includes more than just the returns to capital. So I'm not going to go into the Hope Crisis Continuum here. I covered it one before. This is the slide number 20. I'm going to be showing this once before, but it's essentially showing a phase change. On the left side, before you get to the maximum amount of crisis, there's a change in society. Might be the adoption of a single tax. It might be ending hunger, ending poverty, implementing, the single tax. So how to distribute produced wealth? Wages from the labor that people put in, interest back to the capitalist, and rent for social adjustments. That's a way to distribute wealth, and we'll get into that for a second. Now, he does talk about the margin of cultivation, and this is an important concept that doesn't necessarily need to be applied just to agriculture. Agriculture production, but even in manufacturing, there's a point at which people can produce without the payment of rent. And this is the important point in the readings today, because when you get to that point at the margin of cultivation, the margin of production, where you don't pay rent, that determines the wages that you get. And but in the case what we're showing here is that you can farm and do agricultural work without capital. The photo you see on the slide on page 20, slide 24, is very minimal capital. Primarily the horse or the animal pulling the stick in the ground that's turning up the soil. And this is just showing that whenever you have this kind of arrangement with no heavy capital, the returns typically go back to labor and land, very clearly showing that, well, if you don't pay rent, then there's more that can go back to labor and land, or rent in the case of the land. But then when you get into more complex operations, including agriculture and even manufacturing, you've got the labor and land coming together with capital, making production, and you see the layout of the distribution of wealth that are pretty well defined in book number 3. That's what that book was all about. What we show here is the 3 factors of production: land, labor, and capital. Producing rent, a true wages fund that Henry George talks about, and the return to capital, which is the interest. Importantly, you replace the consumed capital, and that's the minimum amount of production that you need to have in order to keep the process going. Like I said, the flywheel of the economy, that if you don't replace your consumed capital, it gets worse, and you have delays, and people go home because the factory's burning up or something. And then this is a real good slide that probably be coming back to quite often, because this shows where if we don't have the rent going to the landowner for the unearned increment of wealth that we find as what we're trying to capture in a single tax, and rather goes to infrastructure services like the MTA, like the schools, paying teachers the same salary, for example, as somebody who picks up the garbage for the sanitation department. That would be a good program that I think should have a lot of support, because what are teachers doing anyway but to improve the wealth of our community? But Henry George identifies 20 types of infrastructure in social problems that includes like library, public schools, public health, all these things that need money. And so why are we allowing the unearned increment of wealth to go to the rentier class? And like I say, rent should go to the community. That's the point. So here we are on page 29. Slide 29 just provides all the citations where you can find all these terms that are identified here. So this is the beginning of the class tonight on slide number 30. So let's head out and see how far we can get. I do have readings that I'd like people to volunteer for, and when we get to the reading, I'll get up, or somebody can come up here and get the slide. Maybe you can get that, Ralph. And maybe, I got the numbers on the top, and it's 1, 2, 3. Yeah. So just take the whole slide. Then you can solicit people to. But we're not getting that's what's out there. So just hold on to them. Unless people want to volunteer, but I think the best way to handle it would be, Ralph, for you just to hold on to them, and if nobody else reads it, maybe you could. That's how we did it last time.
We got good volunteers.
Oh, we got a volunteer. Okay, good. Okay, so we're going to talk about spurious capital and of profits often mistaken for interest. And we're on slide 31 for people following on. George spends an entire chapter on things that are not central to his thesis. So throughout this book, he's laying a thesis out. He sometimes says, we can define what wages are or interests are by inferring what we just talked about. And then he says, well, let's go at it from an independent analysis, which further underscores that he's on the right track. So he does this so that you're not fooled by people of the current thinking. This is a term he brings up a lot, because he is writing this book essentially saying that what you see in the current textbooks in the popular literature is primarily all wrong. Certain parts are right, but he's putting together a simple and coherent idea about how the science of political economy works. So he starts out on chapter 4, which is the first chapter of this class for tonight, number 5, talking about government bonds. And I think we all are aware of government bonds, where people invest, they get a rate of return. Sometimes it's tax-free. But there's 3 ways of looking at these. War and materials of war. You're saying, well, government bonds can go to that, but it's not an increase of capital. He talks about war and the materials of war being a waste of wealth that just goes for destruction and death. Of course, he's writing in 1879. In 20 years, there's going to be a Spanish-American War, and I suppose we could all debate what the value of that war was. But number 2 was infrastructure spending. He talks about the deepening of a riverbed. He never uses the word infrastructure. He's talking about public services and these kind of social adjustments. He uses that phrase a lot. But I call it infrastructure. I'm actively working on on infrastructure issues in my outside of Henry George School life. And then the third one, which is one that he has particular interest, private railroad company. And he's saying that it's okay to have a government bond to advance railroads and railroad traffic as long as the bonds aren't issued in excess of the capital used. He talked about management rings and people who don't necessarily work very productively within the railroad company. And that's what he was talking about, the risks of government bonds doing that. And then he uses the following device to illustrate how the monopoly of railroads sap the wealth that could otherwise be used in a proper distribution of wealth. So this is where he begins to start talking about, if you can imagine a rectangle, and somewhere in the bottom is the amount of wealth creation for the maintaining the wealth of the capital, which is replacing the capital that's consumed, and then the maximum amount of capital being used to manufacture, keep the flywheel going. But anything in excess of that maximum is a waste of wealth. It's kind of like spinning the flywheel disconnected from whatever it needs to be connected to. So you slow it back to where, okay, now it's in sync and it's running the spinning wheel and whatever they used to use in the 19th century. So that's the point in slide number 32. Slide 33, monopolies typically acquire large masses of capital. I just abbreviate it LMC just so I don't have to keep saying large masses of capital, under common control. A new and essentially different power from the power of increase of capital that Henry George calls interest. And this is where he makes a very important point. Large masses of capital are more insidious than protective tariffs. And we know that he wrote a whole book on protection or free trade. Here's a situation where he puts a hierarchy that the Henry George theorem, capturing the land value, is his primary first principles, is what he's arriving at. And then he says that large masses of capital is his secondary concern, because he says that is more insidious than protective tariffs. So it's just an interesting hierarchy that he has in his writing. So he describes what happens in the first railroads that approach the town. And let me know if you see the parallel between this and the National Football League teams that go into a city and say, how much are you going to give me if I put the stadium here? And it's like, yeah, we really need the football stadium. And sometimes it gets to the point where cities break even or even take a loss. Essentially, they said, pay up or we'll pass you up. They'll take the railroad near the city and bring somebody up front. Okay, well, we'll bypass the city for 2 miles. And it would be better off that there was no railroad, because now things are being diverted and it's worse for that city. Also, large masses of capital undercut competition only then to drive it up. We see some examples of this, like in Walmart, that come into town, run all the local businesses away, and then when they're all gone, then they can do whatever they want with the prices. And then another interesting thing in the Progress and Poverty, and I'm just reporting the facts, I'm not injecting any personal bias, but he often cites British genocide, and in this case it was the India's Rohingyas killed by a local enforcer who's hired by Warren Hastings. So he was just giving an example of spurious capital, highwaymen, con men, murderers, and you can also throw in there the Opium Wars. That was not a friendly period in the history of China by any means. So the first reading, who's going to be okay, we got a volunteer. It's on page 193. We're on slide 34, the corrupt concentrated capital. So here's Henry George. Oh, we need to get you the microphone. And speak speak into the microphone. We're trying to get the audio into this microphone up here. That's what we're trying to do.
It is necessary only to allude to these things, not to dwell on them. Everyone knows the tyranny and rapacity with which capital, when concentrated in large amounts, is frequently wielded to corrupt, to rob, and to destroy. What I wish to call the reader's attention to is that profits thus derived are not to be confounded with the legitimate returns of capital as an agent of production.
Okay, we got a reading number 2. It's just continuing on, and you're welcome to. And speak up a little bit louder so we...
They are for the most part to be attributed to a maladjustment of forces in the legislative department of government and to a blind adherence to ancient barbarisms and the superstitious reverence for the technicalities of a narrow profession in the administration of law, while the general cause which in advancing communities tends, with the concentration of wealth to the concentration of power, is the solution of the great problem we are seeking for, but have not yet found.
Okay, yeah, so let's, we'll have a few more readings in a little bit. So going on to chapter 4, continuing on, concentrated capital, wealth is not from power of capital. Large masses of capital, concentrations, often act upon bad social adjustments for success. So how about profits from the elements of risk, such as taking chances, gambling, as in stock dealing, which is stock market. Con men, what one gains, somebody must lose. These are not increases from the power of capital. Who are these that so many respect? So he lists several people that were prominent in 1879 and before. And it's kind of interesting to question, why did he leave some names off of this list? For example, Andrew Carnegie, Rockefeller. But here's the list that was identified in chapter 4. He has some royal families like the Dukes of Westminster, the Marquises of Bute, the Stuarts. I think he might have misspelled Stuart because the Marquis of Bute are the Stuarts. Then he has another line. But what he's getting at in this is 2 of the prominent activities of these names here were involved in the railroads. And that was one of his big bugaboos with Henry George, was the way that the railroads would just cross the United States, that sometimes were giving away land. They would, as the land value goes up, the United States should have anticipated Henry George and said, why are we giving the railroads this land as well as the tracks and all this other thing? Because that's how they made a lot of their money. Before I get off this list, it was kind of interesting that the Rothschilds were the bankers for the royalty in the UK, and they were involved in railroads worldwide. So they had their hand in that operation. And another interesting fact about the Rothschild banking interest was that they intervened in the conflict between Portugal and Brazil, and essentially bought Brazil's independence from Portugal, and then the interest on the loan that they gave out would go back to the Rothschild Bank. So maybe they saved some people from having to die in a revolution, but that was an interesting piece of history that I didn't know until I read that. He had 2 other names, Stanford and Flood, but I didn't study that. But anybody want to speculate on why Rockefellers and Carnegie wasn't among this? Do you think maybe their wealth didn't happen until after 1879? Think that might be the... Okay. Maybe because they produced something like gasoline or steel or... Yeah, that might have been. Because this is the chapter on spurious capital, that they didn't get it from the increase in,
I think that was before its time.
yeah. So that was chapter 4, and so we went through that pretty quick. We're into this for about a half hour now, so I think we're making pretty good progress. So today we're going to talk about chapter 5 now, the law of interest. So you have to remember that labor employs capital, not the other way around. This is on page 195, and you should have gotten that very clearly in the first 4 classes. But capital is not fixed. There's a constant flow of wealth to capital and capital to wealth. Again, I think he likes this flywheel example about things aren't fixed, that it goes fast and it slows down. Maximum is given to capital is the interest it will bring. Minimum replaces consumed capital. So I mentioned that.
I have a question. Could it be that the Rockefellers were so wealthy that they could not be, I guess is the wrong word, controlled?
Well, I think I'll get to that at the end, but I think the Vanderbilts were the wealthiest when the Cornelius died in 1871 or something. He was the wealthiest, and then his son became the...
He died in 1877.
77, okay. And then his son then became the wealthiest. So, I think Rockefeller's wealth increased after that. So then, so he has an interesting example in chapter 5 on the law of interest. And he has this example of Native Americans. So before the bow and arrow, he says that the most they could kill as far as buffalo, using sticks and stones and such, were maybe 1 buffalo a day. But when they got the bow and arrow, they could kill 6 or 7. So the question was, did the person who created the bow and arrow, the labor, do you owe him 6 of those 7 buffaloes now that he increased this tool? And he makes a very important point, and I'm going to be making this to you, is that it's no, he shouldn't get the 6 or 7 extra buffaloes. It's not the increased efficiency to labor that fixes maximum production. It is the average power of increase, which belongs to capital generally, type of a phase change as exhibited in the Hope Crisis Continuum that I'll show in a second. So the advance in the arts has created a common property. So this bow and arrow now is a new technology, just as artificial intelligence is a new technology. And it's a common property and a power of labor. And he makes the point that this is not efficiency. It's not labor efficiency. It's a totally new thing. So like I explained in the first 2 classes, with this relationship between hope and crisis, new technologies, new ways of doing things, increases in the power of production is the point of the phase change on the slide 42 of the Hope Crisis Continuum. So we're on the right side of the maximum crisis, and crisis is decreasing because you've got a new way of doing things, more productivity, and the hope is increasing. So slide 43, we're on page 97 of Progress and Poverty. And he talks about the reproductive powers of nature, the increase of interest from beneficial forces in nature that allow an abundance of commodities to exist. However, values play a moderating influence. He has this example of the difference between rabbits and horses. If you raised rabbits, there'd be a lot more rabbits, so you might think that, well, shoot, I can get more than if I raised a horse because rabbits are multiplying faster and faster. But you might notice that as you get more and more rabbits, the price of the rabbit would drop down, and the horses are not multiplying that much. So it's a matter of value, and that's what he was getting at in the reproductive powers of nature. Industrial communities are not limited by political or geographical division. but international exchange. So you start thinking internationally and trade. So you're sitting there in England producing something, steel or other kind of manufacturing, and you can trade with the United States or India or other nations. So you're not really dependent on the person that's selling rabbits, for example. It has no impact on what you're doing. Yet there's a balance between agriculture and manufacturing yields, and yields a normal rate of interest. So this is a ratio that he's talking about. So he's getting that if something is not panning out in your manufacturing operation, the idea that you can always abandon that and go to agriculture and achieve that rate of interest. So he's saying that there's opportunities out there. If something doesn't work out, you can go to something else. So he's saying, and therefore there's this ratio of normal rate of interest. Might be 10%, might be 20%, might vary in time, but it's not going to swing between 1% and 99. You know, again, in this idea of the flywheel, that you're producing things, are then you get advances, and that might allow a larger flywheel to spin. So labor and capital are different forms of the same thing. And this is a common thing that he's saying in this book 3, is the interchangeability of labor and capital, and it's human exertion. In fact, he makes a point that capital is nothing more than stored up labor. As energy is stored in coal, you have labor in capital. And this gets back to the points that we made in the earlier part of the book about how wages come from labor, don't come from capital. So he's talking about interest is the return on capital that capital can secure, less insurance and the wages of superintendents. So there are things that you have to subtract whenever you have production going on. And you might recall from the flow diagram, we had to replace consumed capital. So you might add these other things if you want to get what the interest is. So he makes a point that law of interest is a corollary to the law of rent on page 201. We're on slide 45 here. What can be earned in production of flour depends mostly on the price of wheat, as the milling costs change little in normal times. The price of wheat, which is based on the best land open to production without the payment of rent, it could be an issue of seasons, whether there's a war going on. As rent rises, interest will fall as wages fall, or will be determined by the margin of cultivation. So what he's saying is that if you producing in a place that doesn't charge rent, then you have a opportunity for wages and interest to increase, because there's nobody siphoning off the extra profit. But let's say you've got a business and you could expand your business by moving into Manhattan. Paying the rent in Manhattan might counter the benefit of that move. Okay, we got the third reading, and we're on page 46, or slide 46. The reading is from page 201, the corollary to the law of rent. So let's hear what Henry George had to say.
Or as leaving the connecting link, the price of wheat to inference, we say that the price of flour depends upon the character of the seasons, wars, etc. So may we put the law of interest in a form which directly connects it with the law of rent, by saying that the general rate of interest will be determined by the return to capital upon the poorest land to which capital is freely applied. That is to say, upon the best land open to it without the payment of rent. Thus we bring the law of interest into a form which shows it to be a corollary of the law of rent.
Okay, and then we go to the next one. Somebody want to do the reading for what follows. And hold the mic close and speak up.
No, not that. I think you want to read that. I already read it. The same one?
We may prove this conclusion in another way. For that interest must decrease as rent increases. We can plainly see if we eliminate wages. To do this, we must imagine a universe organized on totally different principles. Nevertheless, we may imagine that Carlyle would call a fool's paradise, where the production of wealth went on without the aid of labor and solely by the reproductive forces of capital, where sheep bore ready-made clothing on their backs, cows presented butter and cheese, and oxen, when they got to the proper point of fatness, carved themselves into beefsteaks and roasting ribs, where houses grew from the seed, and a jackknife thrown upon the ground would take root and in due time bear a crop of assorted cutlery.
Yeah. So this is an example of Georgist humor. We got one more on slide 48. Somebody want to imagine certain capitalists? You can continue if you like.
I've got 49 here.
Well, this is 48.
I have to read it off.
I can't remember.
Okay.
Maybe you just read it off the side there.
Yeah. Imagine certain capitalists transported with their capital in the appropriate forms to such a place. Manifestly, they would get, as the return of their capital, the whole amount of wealth it produced, only so long as none of its produce was demanded as rent. When rent arose, it would come out of the produce of capital, and as it increased, the return of the owners of capital must necessarily diminish.
And I got at least one more.
I think Helen, you have
I've
that?
got it here. If we imagine the place where capital possessed this power of producing wealth without the aid of labour to be of limited extent, say an island, we shall see that as soon as capital had increased to the limit of the island to support it, the return to capital must fall to a trifle above its minimum of mere replacement, and the land's owners would receive nearly the whole produce as rent, for the only alternative capitalists would be to throw their capital into the sea.
Okay. So we appreciate the readings. Continuing on with chapter 5, the law of interest, a relation between wages and interest, is determined by the average power of increase which attaches to capital from its use in reproductive modes. Page 203 of Progress and Poverty. We're on slide 50. As rent rises, interest will fall as wages fall, or will be determined by the margin of cultivation. You see, he's repeating this concept of the margin of cultivation where you don't pay rent. Capital is a form of labor. The primary division of wealth in distribution is dual, not tripartite, he says on page 203. So that was chapter 5. He gets into the law of interest, and I think it's clear what he's getting at, the return to capital. So now chapter 6 is wages and the law of wages. And he continues on saying, yes, we have the law of wages by inference from what we've discussed already. Page 204, slide 52. Now let's start from an independent starting point. So he's trying to bring home this point, saying that, yeah, we can infer this, but let's go at it a different way. There is no common rate of wages, which is a quantity or a proportion, as there is no common rate of interest, or as there is a common rate of interest. So there is a common rate of interest, which is a ratio, which I try to describe that it doesn't vary between 1 and 99. It's usually some rate of interest that if people don't do this, they'll do something else. So wages vary among occupations. There is a general relation between all wages. They rise and fall in obedience to a common law. And we're trying to get this point where if there is no if there is no rent, then there's more production to be shared between the capitalist and the laborer. So here's where I abbreviate this fundamental principle of human action, MSTGTDWTLE. And if you can remember that, you might, I used to memorize stuff and I used to have things like this. So you might think must get dweedle, whatever that means. But if you had that mental image, you could always repeat what the fundamental principle of human action is. This is slide 53. Men seek to gratify their desires with the least exertion. You see this so often in the book, but I just gave you an acronym that you could write on your arm, or if you forget what the principle is. This brings to an equality through competition. It induces a reward gained by the equal exertion under similar circumstances. So this is how he's getting at the science of political economy, saying that this principle is just as gravity is physics, that men gratifying their desires with least exertion is a principle that he's saying is fundamental to the distribution of wealth. For the self-employed and others, this is done through prices. Wages are fixed by the value, the produce of such labor to the laborers themselves. And then this, men seek to gratify their desires with least exertion. Fixed wages at produce, fixed wages at the produce of such labor at the highest natural productiveness open to it, without the payment of rent. So wages, this is slide 54. Wages are based on what labor receives at the lowest point of cultivation, page 207. Wages depend on the margin of cultivation. These are things that he's saying. Now, you might think that Henry George was a 100% Adam Smith advocate. He says that Adam Smith failed to apprehend the true laws of the distribution of wealth because he turned away from the primitive forms of society to look for principles amid complex social manifestations, and accepting Malthus's theory of population and accepted theories of the function of capital. So he had some criticism of Adam Smith. So he's standing on his shoulders and adding to the science. So he mentions also on page 207, it's meaningless to say that the general rate of wages is determined by the supply and demand. So he's critical of this concept that's pretty much accepted in schools of economics. He's saying that the principle of supply and demand is only true at a particular time. There are relative terms. And in fact, if you say that the supply of labor is dependent on its demand, is actually buying into the intellectual gutter talk about wages coming from capital. So it's these little tricks that you have to be aware of, because you learn that the law of supply and demand always is in effect. But he's saying that you're being tricked if you're accepting that the supply of labor is dependent on the demand for labor. So this fallacy about supply and demand is believed by those who say wages are paid by capital, which is something that I just said. However, the rarity of qualities required causes wages to rise, similar to the ability of a worker to work fast. So if somebody has a rare quality where they understand something quickly, they can overcome errors in a production process and fix it. You pay people higher wages for that kind of thing. Fundamental occupations procure wealth directly from nature and what they can produce at the lowest point of natural productiveness. Wages depend on the margin of cultivation or the highest point of natural productiveness without the payment of rent. This is points that he makes over and over, but he's doing it now in terms of this chapter 6 on wages and the law of wages. So we have another reading, law of wages. We got a volunteer, and hold the microphone close to your mouth and speak up real loud. You can read the slide if you like.
So obvious is this law that it is often so obvious it,
Yes, Sean, Sean.
so obvious is this law that it is often apprehended without being recognized. It is frequently said of such countries as California and Nevada that cheap labor would enormously aid their development, as it would enable the working of the poor, but most extensive deposits of ore. A relation between low wages and a low point of production is perceived by those who talk in this way, but they invert cause and effect. It is not low wages which will cause the working of low-grade ore, but the extension of production to the lower point, which will diminish wages. If wages could be arbitrarily forced down, as has sometimes been attempted by statute, the poorer mines would not be worked so long as richer mines could be worked.
Oh, so we're, okay. We got a little bit more. Starts with, but if the margin of production.
But if the margin of production were arbitrarily forced down, as it might be, with the superior natural opportunities and the ownership of those who chose rather to wait for future increase of value than to permit them to be used now, wages would necessarily fall. The demonstration is complete. The law of wages we have thus obtained is that which we previously obtained as the corollary of the law of rent, and it completely harmonizes with the law of interest.
Okay, and let me, okay, this is the big point and the drum roll, and we got these words in purple that he's emphasizing.
Wages depend upon the margin of production, or upon the produce which labor can obtain at the highest point of natural productiveness open to it without the payment of rent.
About the payment of rent. We're on slide 58. And then below there, this law of wages.
The law of wages accords with and explains universal facts that without its apprehension seem unrelated and contradictory. It shows that where land is free and labor is unassisted by capital, the whole produce will go to laborers' wages.
Okay, we got another reading.
Which one is 59? Yeah, 59?
Oh,
Where land is free and labor is assisted by capital, wages will consist of the whole produce, less that part necessary to induce the storing up of labor as capital. Where land is subject to ownership and rent arises, wages will be fixed by what labor could secure from the highest natural opportunities open to it without the payment of rent. Where natural opportunities are all monopolized, wages may be forced by the competition among laborers to the minimum at which laborers will consent to reproduce.
oh, we got another one. Maybe Bashara, maybe you want to read? Yeah, you can read it off the, if you, so hold the microphone to your mouth and speak up.
From the beginning, right? In its simpler manifestations, this law of wages is recognized by people who do not trouble themselves about political economy. Just as the fact that a heavy body would fall to the earth was long recognized by those who never thought of the law of gravitation. It does not require a philosopher to see that if any country natural opportunities were thrown open which would enable laborers to make for themselves wages higher than the lowest now paid, the general rate of wages would rise, while the most ignorant and stupid of the placer miners of early California knew that as the placers gave out or were monopolized, wages must fall. It requires no fine-spun theory to explain why wages are so high relative to production in new countries where land is yet unmonopolized.
And we got a little bit more. You want to do it, Ralph? Just read it off the.
I'm gonna try my best.
Yeah, hold the mic.
We don't have 61.
Oh, you can't see that?
Oh, okay, thank you. The cause is not on the surface. One man will not work for another for less than his labor will really yield. When he can go upon the next quarter section and take up a farm for himself. It is only as land becomes monopolized and these natural opportunities are shut off from labor, the laborers are obliged to compete with each other for unemployment. And it has become possible for the farmer to hire hands to do this work while he maintains himself on the difference between what their labor produces and what the pays them for it.
Oh, and then we got another one. You wanna read?
Okay, dogs would bite them.
This is dog would bite them.
The chapter contains numerous expressions which, like the opening sentence in this chapter on the wages of labor, show that Adam Smith failed to appreciate the true laws of distribution of wealth only because he turned away from more primitive forms of society, looked for the first principles amid complex social manifestations where was balanced by the pre-acceptance theory of functions of capital, and it seems to me by a vague acceptance of the doctrine which 2 years after his death was formulated by Malthus. It is impossible to read the works of the economists who since the time of Smith have endeavored to build up and elucidate the science of political economy without seeing how over and over again to stumble over the laws of wages without once recognizing it.
Got one more. We got a new volunteer.
I got it here, sorry.
Yeah, we're almost done.
The dog would bite them, okay. Yet, if it were a dog.
It would bite him. So the law of wages is so obvious that if it was a dog, it would bite him.
Indeed, it's difficult to resist the impressions that some of them really saw this law of wages, but fearful of the practical conclusions to which it leads, preferred to ignore and cover it up rather than use it as a key to the problem. Without it are so perplexing. A great truth to an age which has rejected and trampled on it. It's not a word of peace, but a sword.
Yeah. Well, that's good. Appreciate all the reading. And Henry George likes long sentences, and I guess if you get into it, you get the first part of the sentence, then you read the other thing. It's kind of like a commercial break. Then you get to the end of it where he's concluding the concept. So I like reading the original text. So the last two chapters, and we've been at this for an hour now, so we're getting close to time where we can ask questions and go from there. So chapter 7 is the correlation and the coordination of these laws. In fact, I put on the table around here from chapter 7, and essentially this is the summary of what he's getting at. So why don't we maybe just take a look at this, and yeah. So he's saying the current statement and then what the true statement is. So we just read all these quotes by Henry George, and so the current statement, this is the falsehood, the intellectual gutter talk, I guess the way. So rent depends on the margin of cultivation, rising as it falls and falling as it rises. It just so happens that the law of rent is the same as what Henry George says is the true statement. So in the case of rent, it's the same thing, that the rent depends on the margin of cultivation, rising as it falls and falling as it rises. And this is from Ricardo. But what you'll see is a vast difference in the other two. And what you'll see once you're done reading this is that there's a harmony and a simplicity in the way Henry George is presenting it. And this is kind of like the summary of the whole Progress and Poverty book, because if this doesn't make sense, you're not going to make sense of the book itself. So the current statement, the way political economists were talking about it in his time, would say that wages depend upon the ratio between the number of laborers and the amount of capital devoted to their employment. So this is what we rejected early on in these classes, the idea that capitalists have this fund of money that they draw down on to pay laborers. And you might recall my example of, if I remember when I was a kid and I had a lemonade stand, and the thought of me selling lemons so I can pay my sister to sit at the table makes no sense. But that's exactly what they're talking about here, that capitalists would have this fund that they pay laborers. The way to think about it, the true statement is that wages depend on the margin of cultivation, falling as it falls and rising as it rises. What he's saying is that wages are paid by labor. And you might recall the second class I taught where they talk about building a tunnel, and the labor is going into that next 100 feet of tunnel, and that's the produce of labor, and that's what they got paid for. It wasn't the fact that somebody borrowed money and paid the laborers some money. They actually accomplished something that's going to be turned into wealth in the future. So then the idea of interest. Interest depends, and this is the false statement, the current statement. Interest depends upon the equation between the supply of and demand of capital, or as stated, of profits upon wages, or the cost of labor, rising as wages fall and falling as wages rise. And this is the opposite of what Henry George talks about interest. Its ratio being wages being fixed by the net power of increase which attaches to capital, depends on the margin of cultivation, falling as it falls and rising as it rises. And this is the primary difference, is that there's this unity between capital and labor. In fact, he says that capital is nothing more than stored up labor. So it only makes sense that interest and wages go up together, fall together, and dependent on whether there's more rent being charged that has to go out, because that's, rent is consuming the interest and wages. So, keep this in your notebook, put 3 holes in it and refer to it every day, and see if you can remember those relationships, because he gets, it's the primary first principles of what Henry George is talking about. So book 7 and 8 aren't really that long. I think chapter 7 is like 2 pages, and chapter 8 is like 3 or 4. This is about correlation and coordination, and we just read that table that was on slide 64, but it's on page 219 in chapter 7, book 3. Correlation and coordination, that's how the how rent, wages, and interest cooperate. And he makes a very big point in the slide that I'm going to be reading, is that on the left side, the current statement, there's no rhyme or reason. It's almost like, well, I've got an opinion and this is how rent works, and I've got an opinion, this is how wages work, I've got an opinion and this is how interest works. Henry George is laying out those these returns, you know, the true statement that has harmony, has simplicity. So competition prevents the return to labor and capital being anywhere greater than upon the poorest land in use. Political economy of 1879 and today view the laws of distribution of wealth. They have no common center. This is what I just mentioned about the current statement on that table. There's no common center between rent, wages, and interest. There's no mutual relation as there is in the way Henry George presented it. They do not have correlating divisions of a whole. In the example of Henry George, it does represent a whole, but when you start talking about interest and profits and wages and rent, they measure different qualities between the two. And the George's laws of distribution, on the other hand, they spring from a common point. They're always talking about the marginal cultivation, because that's where you don't pay rent, and that's how everything is being compared to. They support and supplement each other. So this is a good example that you might be on the right track. In fact, we're going to be getting into the comparison between the science of astronomy and the science of political economy that makes this point a little bit better. They support and supplement each other. They form correlating divisions of a complete whole. And then the last chapter in the class tonight is the statics of the problem, thus explained. The resemblance between the science of political economy and the science of astronomy. This is slide 68, page 221. There was an elaborate, apparent system to explain the sense certainty of an Earth-based universe. You know about Ptolemy saying that the universe revolves around the Earth, and in order to prove that with what they're seeing in their telescopes, they invented all these relationships to explain it, but they couldn't explain everything. And then Copernicus gave a theory that was simple and he had harmony to the actual system, which is a sun-based solar system. So you have and he's making this example that in the science of political economy, it's kind of like everything is shoehorned to fit together because, well, that's just the way it is. And Henry George is saying, uninvited to this party, kind of like the turd in the punch bowl, saying, no, this is wrong. This is the way we should see it. And he explained it very simply with great harmony. So the failure of wages to increase with the increase of productive power is due to increased rent. So whatever rent gets, their decrease in the increase of the productive power. So not the total produce, but the net produce after rent is removed that determines what can be divided as wages and interest. And that's page 223. And then near the end here, we're on slide 70, chapter 8, the statics of problem explained. Wages and interest is fixed, is everywhere fixed, not by productiveness of labor, but by the value of land. So wages and interest is fixed by the value of land, because when the value when rent can be had, when land can be held with and used productively without paying rent, you have higher interest and wages. The value of land is low, wages and interests are high. You see how they work together. Value of land high, wages and interests are low. So it's just a matter of where the wealth is being distributed. Increase of land value always at the expense of value of labor. Increase of productive power does not increase wages, it raises rent. So when we have these increases in productive power, like artificial intelligence, other inventions from this period to present day, it's not increasing wages necessarily, especially if you can lay off workers because you got machines doing it, but you're raising rent. And we all know that Henry George's solution to the poverty problem is to acquire the unearned increment of rent and use it for the social adjustments. Some people think that perhaps these social adjustments could be a universal basic income, which a lot of people believe. Just the fact that people are using the income to run their life, there is an economy that's created in that way. And if the money originates with increasing land values, what's the problem? Because that money is really not coming from anybody's pocket, because land values are created by individuals just living in a city, participating, being part of the community. And it's these investments that have been made over the years that increases land values to begin with. So that was the material for the book 3, the second half of book 3. I did want to just go real briefly in what you're going to hear in the next class, class number 6. And before I get off this topic, next class, is it next week? 14th. November 14th, 2 weeks from tonight, Steve Taft is going to be talking about book 4, which is class 6. And there's 4 chapters in book 4. Talked about dynamics, population and distribution of wealth, improvements in arts and wealth distribution, expectations of material progress. This should be a very interesting lecture. The questions that come up are topics, for example, in dynamics. The question is, do steamships move because their wheels turn around? Well, no, the wheels turn around, but they're in water. That's how they move. Productiveness of a higher kind, subdividing branches of production. So that's a way of increasing productiveness. Improvements in the art and wealth distribution. Yes, labor-saving devices increase the power of labor, but more importantly, they extend the margin of cultivation and could lead to the increase of rent. So these increases in the power of production, they're increasing rent, and that should be a good thing. But we need to also have the people monitoring this increase in rent so that we can collect it for the infrastructure, reproducing the things that made the land valuable in the first place. Like the land is not going to stay high in the value if the subways stop running or the quality of the subways go down. Those are things that we need to maintain the capital. Then chapter 4 is the expectation of material progress. Expectations lead to speculation and increasing land values, thus further extending the margin of cultivation, as in leapfrogging, kind of like subdivisions, where people are holding out for speculative purposes. People say, well, enough of that, I'll just go 10 miles away, and maybe the subway will pick it up and I can just bypass. But if you just think about the waste of resources with that happening with speculation. So that was the class for today. I did talk about, for the people that came late, about this article in Saturday's New York Times about private equity firms buying up dermatology practices because a lot of revenue can be acquired through Medicare payments for dermatology, and I guess they did a lot of calculations. So the question at the end of it, the doctor who is blowing the whistle on this thing, he says, I realize we live in a capitalist society, and I think Henry George believed that we live in a capitalist society, but if you think about what we were just reading is that labor creates capital. So right off the bat, this quote is making an assumption that there's capitalists that rule the world, will rule the economy. It's only because we've kind of allowed them to do that. If we understood Henry George correctly, we'd say this a little bit differently. So he says, I realize we live in a capitalist society and money is a driving force behind many decisions. Money. So we need to think about, is it something that society needs to do to end poverty? Henry George believed that poverty is is the biggest scourge of mankind, that we can have progress and end poverty by capturing the unearned increment of land value. So I realize we live in a capitalist society and money is a driving force behind many decisions regardless of the industry. However, I believe there has to be a balance between profit and patient care. So is it moral to reap excess profits in a monopoly situation on making people healthy? Because a society is only of a higher value if we're all healthy, well-educated, well-fed, we have clean water, and all these things that we need for infrastructure. So I just threw that out maybe to spark a discussion because we've got some time. It's 8 o'clock. We've been here an hour and a half, but I'm free to discuss. Anybody want to take the microphone and discuss anything? Do you think that the private equity firms maybe if they become monopoly, they triple the cost like they do with pharmaceutical drugs, like the guy that went to jail for quadrupling the, what do you think?
What I'm finding is that there's just so much to absorb, Am I doing it wrong? Up, down?
No, it just has to be straight. It's like eating a ice cream cone, you know?
Hello?
Yeah.
Well, let me speak without it. I think my voice is deep enough that you can hear.
You have to speak louder, though.
Okay. I'm finding that there is so much to absorb that I am getting very confused. I understand it and I don't understand it.
Yeah.
And I feel that maybe one of the things that might have happened with each chapter or each sequence, that maybe we should have stopped and discussed it so that me personally would understand it. I have come to all the classes and I'm still, I guess the word confused or don't understand it completely. The whole concept between land, labor, wealth, rent, etc. I also am coming from another place today of the way I see capital, labor, interest, wages, etc. And I personally am getting confused between both of them.
Yeah.
Because the way I see how we operate today, there's a part of me that says, because of the wealth, even though we have poverty, the wealth has made this society so fantastic.
Yeah.
and that the wealth has had the, shall we call it, the capital, I should use that word, the capital to help improve, create, bring so much into our society.
Okay.
And when I think of Henry George, who is brilliant, I have to read his sentences over and over again to get them. His vocabulary is absolutely fabulous. Some of the words, I mean, I know what the words mean, but when he puts them together, I get lost.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether it would help, or maybe everybody does understand it, if when we did this, we took like one segment at a time to where we really understood it.
Well, this is one of the reasons why we're recording all this, so that you can watch it as many times as you want. And also, maybe come early, stay late, and we can discuss this. But I wanted somebody to maybe weigh in on Nina's question, like Olaf, you wanna respond? Yeah.
I mean, you know something? I don't think people are honest. I think we get ashamed to admit that we're ignorant.
Well, that's okay.
We don't
I mean,
understand this. And I feel very frustrated and trying to figure out how can we take Henry George's philosophy into our society today.
Yeah. Yeah, you have to speak right into it.
Well, yeah, I just want to say that, you know, you just have to read the book like, this is the third time I'm reading the book. And cover to cover, you know, just like when I read the Bible cover to cover. It took me a long time. But Henry George, you know, a little bit less.
Can't even hear her even with the mic.
You have to read the,
Yeah, that's better.
the book, and it's the third time I'm reading it, and cover to cover. Like, I'll continue, even after book 5.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's the best way. And also, we used to have booklets years ago where everybody had to read the certain amount of pages, answer the questions, and then we went over it the next time.
Yeah.
That's the way it was done. But, but there's some basic tenets that everybody understands. For instance, the whole thing about labor paying for itself. You see it in jobs. I've worked in jobs. I never had a job where I didn't have it that way. You usually work 2 to even sometimes 3 or 4 weeks before you get your first paycheck. That's it right there, because it's your work that's creating that wealth.
Yeah.
You know?
Okay. Does that make sense, Nina?
I didn't hear.
Okay. Well, it's a matter of reading, discussing with people, answering questions, thinking about it. Yeah, I think it's really a matter of taking it as I mean, you know, like when I took a professional engineering exam, it's like I had to take everything that I learned in school, study it, and make notes, so that, you know, you got so many hours to take the exam. So, you know, you're making a commitment to become a Georgist. So I guess in a sense you take the 8 basic courses at the Henry George School, and I suppose you get a certificate. That's kind of like a degree, a certificate. So you have to just apply yourself. And the thing to keep in mind is that when Henry George was writing this 140 years ago, he was telling the experts in the field that they're all wrong, and then here's the way to do it. And eventually, efforts were made to counter what Henry George was saying for their own selfish reasons. So you have to understand the history of what this book represents. It's a radical criticizing what's accepted theory and saying, no, it's this. And there are examples that Henry George has been proven right. And every time people say, there's not enough money for X, Y, Z, I almost want to kick the TV set because, well, we haven't talked about the rent that's not getting collected. And so we have this little discussion internal to the Henry George School about using blockchain technology for some social adjustment, let me say, rather than talk about what it really is. But I think there's an application for blockchain technology for property taxes, for example, so that anybody with a computer or you got a GPS and you're standing in front of a property in New York City should be able to hit a button and you find out what the land tax on that property you're looking at. And if you think about it, somebody could, in high school, could say, gee, I wonder how a single tax system would work in New York City. And they say, well, how much are we short on MTA, teachers' raises, health care, homeless services, all these things that don't get done because the experts say, oh, we don't have enough money. And then you say, well, if we tax land value at the proper rate, maybe we would have an excess of trillions of dollars. You don't know that because nobody has really come out and said, here's what the rate is. And there was a talk I gave on June 9th with Yanni and Vincent, Josh Vincent, where I introduced this idea of the cold turkey single tax. And you might recall, if you're here, is that New York City could transition to a single tax system, but it first require that we take everything that's taxed on the improvements and shift it to the land, so that you say, on this day we're going to snap our fingers and everything, the property tax that was for improvements and land is now for land, so that you can put everything in a common framework. And then you get a map that said so many acres, this is how much the land tax is, and you can start saying, well, I wonder why they're paying this much with all these benefits that they're getting. So you, just by doing that, you start this conversation of, well, I wonder what the proper land tax should be. And so that's one idea behind it. And then somebody else had this idea that the Henry George School maybe should become have a course on land assessing, which somebody within the Georgist movement is a expert on, Ted Gwartney. So there's a group that certifies land assessors, and I think we should all become land assessors, because maybe there'll be a job opening and they want a land assessor for a week, and you take a vacation and you gain a lot of experience. But I think these are some practical examples of implementing a Georgia system. And I'm thinking that maybe for Nina's question is, it's kind of like riding a bicycle for the first time. You just don't know how to do it, and then you get on it, and then it's a piece of cake. And I think that's the thing about Henry George and the Georgia system, is that you just need to get involved, and then you say, oh, that's what that's about. Yeah. So those are some thoughts. I don't know if you want to pick up on that and take the microphone and ask any other.
I had a question that I never really understood. Why would there ever be a point where land would be free?
What's that?
In terms of the margin of production, why would there be a point where land would be free? I never really.
Yeah, but I'm gonna have to.
Would the land would be free? Would it ever become possible for land just to be free?
Oh, okay. Yeah, so you have to think about 1879. He always talks about this unbounded savanna, and he was saying that if you didn't like the way the things were, you just go down the road where there's nobody around, and you manufacture, do whatever, because land was essentially free. I mean, I guess there's a price at some point, but conceptually it's low enough. So where the land is free, it means that there's no rent. to pay. So whatever is produced in that situation is the sets the what the wages are, so that if you start going into a city that's more populated, you're going to get a certain amount of rent that you have to pay, which will decrease the amount that you take home. But the person who's owning that land knows that he can pay a wage that if somebody doesn't like it, well, they can just go back to where the rent is cheap. So that's what he was getting at when he was talking about the margin of cultivation, the margin of production. So does that answer your question
Well,
about?
I mean, today, there's no
Oh,
place
today.
anywhere really that
Yeah.
land would be free, right?
Yeah, so in the situation today, it would be relative. So if it costs a certain amount to live in some suburb, well, you've got cities that have like, suburbs and then ring cities, and so there might be between Pittsburgh and the next city like Philadelphia, you've got suburbs and stuff. So if one is, let's say it costs like 10 to live in a certain place, and Philadelphia was 100, then relative, it would be the Pittsburgh would be 0 and the other would be 90. So it's kind of like a relative thing. And so he's saying these things not to get an exact number, margin of cultivation. It's kind of a relative thing.
Yeah, but don't the cities and things like that give you incentives to buy abandoned property? I think a decade ago, or
Yeah.
more than a decade ago, in Harlem, you could buy a brownstone, which was abandoned, and the city was giving it to you for $1.
This is like now?
I'm sorry?
Now they do that?
I'm talking about at least more than 2 decades ago.
Okay, yeah.
Do you remember when Harlem was in a mess and nobody wanted?
Yeah, I moved here in 2010, so if you think about it, the whatever happened in city government, I guess it was Giuliani that had a hand in driving away some of the crime, which increases the value of land, allowed those values to go up. So what didn't happen is that we didn't collect the increase in land value, and we've got this. I don't know, you want to call it a disease. We've got this misperception of how an economy should work, and the cycle is just so long that it's like this is the way it's always been. Well, no, there's other ways that we can do this, and in fact, if you want to end poverty, you look at the capturing the land value. So I think what we need to do is we need to address people who are concerned with poverty and affordable housing, and we're talking about coming up with a conference of people who are activists, and get some allies on our side to where they get the ideas that we're espousing, so they can become our spokespersons and demand a difference. But vacant. So part of that cold turkey single tax idea, what I described was what you do with the developed part. But if you've got vacant land in New York City and you're not paying a rate that's equal to what it would be if it was fully developed, then you're just rewarding some uncle or campaign contributor or whatever by allowing them to sit and speculate on land. And it's like, what do we owe these guys anyway? And why are they taking money out of my pocket?
How do we implement this?
What's that?
How do we implement it?
Well, I think I was talking last night at the social, and I think what we need to do is have it's kind of like what Mao did, or maybe some other famous leader, where they had a 3-year, 5-year plan or something, and say, in so many years we're going to be in charge of this thing. And it could be fun speculation. What do you need to do so that I'm running this thing with equity, no poverty, good motives, like I'm not going to take over and start killing people. Do the things that Henry George promoted, social justice. And I think with a 3 or 5 year plan, if it takes 10, well, I guess you're closer than what you were when it was 0. And I think it's a matter of educating and then having a electoral strategy and getting people who are passionate. Because if you think about it, if you had a plan that could work, it's just a matter of what you want to achieve. I think we could do something over the period of time. But like right now, I think the best thing we can do is start developing the allies. Because we all know that with Citizen United, there's unlimited amount of money goes into campaigns. And, if I ran for office and I'm running on a Georgist platform, you could pay anybody to, $100 to clod me over the head and, make up stuff, I could be Kavanaghed and, and there I am. I'm not running for office anymore. So.
Question. Henry George expounded all of this 140 years ago.
Talk louder.
Pardon me?
Talk louder.
Oh, 140 years ago. None, for some why, I don't know, it hasn't gone into fruition. The world has always had poverty. Do you feel that with Henry George's philosophy that we could really eliminate poverty? With the population being as large as it is,
Yeah.
to change all of this,
Yeah, in fact,
I find it, in trying to understand it all, how we can do it.
Okay,
Because I feel there is, like I'm finding this all so difficult to understand. How do we get all the millions of people
Yeah.
to understand this so we can really eliminate poverty? And when you say eliminate poverty, how do you find a number that will eliminate?
Yeah.
Does somebody have to be, get $1,000 a week, or even if he earned and he was given $1,000, maybe things would be so costly that it would still not end poverty.
Yeah.
Because he can't pay, or the people, the person doesn't have enough even on that $1,000 to live productively.
I think
So
that's right.
it's very
Yeah.
Ibrahim is
hard.
maybe Ibrahima can answer that.
Pardon me?
Ibrahim will be talking about it in the next class on universal basic.
Yeah, it's a good plug for the class.
Oh, okay, because
So answer Nina's question.
you know what? A wealthy person, if he's not worth 25 million, he can feel, and he wants to live in a certain style, and he can't live it, he can't afford it. Is he considered poverty-ridden? And there are a lot of people who I think are wealthy, but they think they're poverty-stricken. They can't do this, they can't buy that, the society is too expensive. And even with this land value tax, will that equalize everything? Will the numbers work out in such a way that poverty will no longer exist? And in my thinking, and what I learned, or what I have read about, is that there's been poverty back in Egyptian time, and even where people worked, but they were paid so little that because this is what the value of this particular job was, couldn't live properly, or what we feel is proper living, and they were poverty stricken. and trying to put Henry George's philosophy into work, what has to happen, and also, how do you get people to understand this? Because not everybody is educated on a certain level to comprehend this. I'm not brilliant, I'm not dumb, I'm finding it difficult to understand because in the society that I live, it works this way. Also, I think one of the biggest concepts that people can't even fathom is this whole thing about land value. And where do you get the land? How do you get the land? I mean, years ago, the land was given by the kings to different people. But today, if you would want land, if I wanted a piece of land, who would I go to get? In other words, someone said to me, but Nina, who did you buy, because I had a house, who did you buy your land from? And I looked at them, I said, what are you talking about? Your hand is on, your property is on land. I said, I didn't think of it that way. It was all connected. I didn't break my house up. I bought it. You bought the property. You didn't think of it as who really owns the land. In other words, after I got finished in the discussion, I felt what an idiot I was. I was buying something and I really don't own it because I don't own the land. And I think maybe that's where I'm having such a difficult time in the classes, trying to comprehend this whole, it seems that what comes up constantly is the whole thing about land. And I don't think we understand it or I mean, even the class, our class is an educated class, if they really comprehend, would you say that you don't own your house because you don't own the land? I bought the house, I paid a mortgage, I paid interest. Tenants paid rent, but I still don't own it. Who owns it then? God? I mean, I think this whole concept, how do you get that all across to the couple, the country, the population, and by doing that, you wipe out poverty. I don't know enough that it could be possible, because if it was possible, since Henry George put this philosophy out 140 years ago, it still hasn't changed. That's a lot of years not to change something.
I think Ibrahima has an answer.
That I am expounding this way. I don't mean to be negative. What I'm trying to do is understand it and see, with this whole concept of Henry George, you can say it will work, but can we really make it work?
Yeah, are we spinning our wheels? So
Yes, you raise 1,000 of questions.
What was that?
You raise many questions. Your first question that I was supposed to answer was, if you have $1,000, would that $1,000 allow you to have a decent living? $1,000 during the Henry George time, that was the equivalent of being a millionaire. Of course, that would have been a great amount of money. But today, if you take into account inflation, prices have gone up and so on. $1,000 is just what you need to have a decent living in a week in New York City, right? So that's what I think Olaf was saying. It somehow connects to the class that we are having next week, which is about, not even next week, tomorrow, on basic income. The idea that the state would give to every citizen some money so that you can have a decent living regardless of whether you have a job or not. Okay? Now, here is the George's position on that. Henry George was one of the first guys who talked about a notion of citizen dividend. So the land value tax that he advocated, he said would not only be enough to defray the cost of governing the country or the city, whatever you call it, but it would allow the government to collect enough revenue to give to everybody a citizen dividend. So that's really, simply put, what the advocates of UBI call UBI, all right? But he did say one thing: it wouldn't work unless you have a land value tax.
Yeah.
You know why? Because if you give everybody $1,000, the landlord will say, well, there is some residual demand in the economy. Regardless of how the economy does, people have money. So let me raise my rent a little bit. So it really defeats the purpose of having an UBI if you don't have an LPT. So the funding mechanism is not just something that helps solve the puzzle, but it's also a requirement to make the UBI functional and effective. And that's what we're going to be talking about tomorrow. One of your questions about inequality has been there, poverty has been there since the time of Egypt. It's been there, but the point was, there was maybe some sort of what you could call collective poverty. There was no great inequality between people and nations. The king was just one powerful guy, but you know, the gap was not that big. You know, so you had inequality, you had poverty, but you had less inequality. The real inequality really started when we got into the industrial age. That's really where we saw the big gap.
Yeah.
And the same thing happened between poor countries and rich countries. Now there was a time the level of development in Africa and the rest of the world and Europe was not very different. The big gap started after the Renaissance and the years after, when they got into the Industrial Revolution and other countries did not. And still that legacy is affecting the rest of the world. Countries that got later in the Industrial Revolution, even among the poorer countries, they are doing a lot better. That's why Asia succeeded, because Asia industrialized and Africa was disindustrialized. That's what happened. So this idea of, you know, people sometimes tend to solve every problem that they have in understanding by just referring to a distant past, because nobody can you know, tell you, well, I was there and this is how it happened. But it was not that bad, believe me. Okay? And one of the things that you talked about, you said you don't own your land. You do own your land if you paid your mortgage. We didn't say that you didn't own it. We are saying we should be in a situation where land is not owned. But the reality today is you own your land. Like we own this place, we own the land here. There's law according to, in the way it is today, the system as we have it today, you can own your land, and that's what you did. Which is actually against what George is saying. George is saying, if we live in a George's world, then what you said would be true. But you own your land, so is my neighbor or the Henry George School owns this land. Okay, so let's make that very clear. We are aspiring for a system where you can own the property on the building and not have to own the land, just like they have it in China. China is one of those interesting places where you have something that you could call a land value tax, because nobody owns the land. The government owns the land, they give leases. They are trying to change the system in order to address the problem that is happening in the Chinese countryside. I was watching a very interesting documentary on NHK, and you see all the big problems that they have in Chinese big city, with slums being created around. So the Chinese government thinks those rural workers are coming to the city when times were good, but that's not the case anymore. So how do you get those guys back into the countryside? So, well, because they have a very powerful government, they just come and round off people and ship them. You know, they force people to go back. They did that. Now, the problem is, people go to those places, there is not much to do. You have to rebuild your life, you have to do something. But there was also something else going on. They built entire cities in the whole China. They became ghost towns. So you go to those places, you meet people at stations, propose to you properties. You know? Now what are they doing to fill those cities? The Chinese government now is allowing freehold in those countryside, allowing those patients to have some sort of ownership that allows them to go to the bank with those documents and then to trade those titles to get money so they could go into those new cities. That's what they are doing. They are creating new cities out of nowhere. And the way they do that is just to changing the land title, you know, decreasing the claims of the state, and then allowing people to use that title, which is valid for a certain amount of year, which really gives them the possibility, some kind of, you know, ownership, you know, code, to go to the bank, borrow money, and then get into those apartments. That's the solution that they are using now. Okay?
I have a question.
Yeah.
It's crazy. If this was to happen, could you become wealthy?
In the George's world? Yeah, you will be wealthy. And you know what would be the great thing about that? You will be wealthy based on your effort, not based on the effort of others. It's going to be a wealthy and just society, you know?
Because the more successful you are,
Yeah.
increases the amount of rent. That rent would go back and hire, you know, the teachers and the sewer workers. And,
Exactly.
you know.
And one of the things that we talk about here is during Henry George's time, those who were against free trade were the monopolists. Those were the guys who, as he described in the social problem, were carrying bags of cash, going to Congress to buy politicians, to push for legislation to allow, not to allow goods flowing in from Europe. And the idea was, we are doing this to protect American workers. I'm sure Ralph will love that idea. But Henry George was against that, because he said that's the stated motive, but the real reason was they wanted to use that to raise prices. Because if you have less supply of good, then the person who produces that good can just raise the price. So it was just a way of limiting competition, you know, under the guise of protecting American jobs. But today what you have is totally different. It is the monopolist and the rent-seeking class that is going with bags of money to Washington to buy free trade agreements so that they could outsource the jobs to China, produce cheaply an iPhone for $35, bring it here and sell it for $1,000 with an American worker who already lost his job to the Chinese worker due to labor arbitrage. And how do they fix that? They loan you money.
Yeah.
You know, they give you a payment plan. If you think an iPhone 10 is too expensive for you to buy in one shot, well, we'll give it to you for $16.
Yeah. So this is the birth of the Trump movement.
You know?
Yeah.
So outsourcing, if you really look at it, the real factor is because of land. When the price of land is expensive, wages will also tend to be expensive, because you cannot pay somebody a wage, you know, that is going to be below the cost of him living. Why is it that wages are expensive, higher in New York than in, for example, Kentucky? Well, it's because if you pay a New Yorker the salary that you pay a guy in Kentucky, he will not be able to find an apartment. So the land price is also, if you look at it, the land price is the reason why the cost of living is increasing. So if you are a company, then that can be enough of a reason to move your company outside. So if we had a land value tax, probably we will not be having all this outsourcing problem that we have today. That's an afterthought, you know, after, you know, giving my classes, and I was having a conversation with Marty. I said today the free traders, the champions of free trade agreements, which is not necessarily free trade, they are the rent-seeking class. And Henry George would have stood up and said to them, that's not the kind of free trade that I meant. And real free trade doesn't make sense if you don't have the mobility of all the factors of production, except of course the land that can move. Workers also should be able to move from one country to another. If you lose your job in Detroit, well, you should be able to come to New York if your company moved to New York. You should be able to come here and seek a job. But that's not happening. Well, that could happen here, but on an international scale, that's not happening. You know? So it's a bit confusing. But if you stick to the...
It's a big job.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
It's not easy, but as you said, it makes sense to really clarify the concept. This idea of a land value tax, we really need to, to define it in such a way to make it accessible. Because I think a lot of people get it confused. We don't have it right now, and that's the reason why we are still advocating it.
I think by the time it happens, I'm not going to be here.
Well, no, I kind of think.
You'll be in a better place.
No, I think that 2018 is going to be the year of the Georgist. And,
Marty.
2028.
well, no, I think 2018 is the birth of a Georgist movement. I think it has to do with the change in the political structure, is that Trump came in and turned everything upside down, and to the point where we really don't have a Republican Party anymore. And then Democrats are trying to find themselves, and so it's going to be interesting what happens this year. But we need to be on our tiptoes for when there's opportunities for us to exhibit a program that's an alternative to what we have. And we've got people who are self-described socialists running, and right now they have no program to speak to. Now, they've got platitudes, but we've got a ready-made program for a socialist to pick up. We don't call ourselves socialists, but our program essentially counters poverty, and that's a big part of a socialist program. So, it doesn't, people are free to take our ideas and run with them. And then, oh, you like that? Well, we've got something else we like to sell you. So I know it, you got the microphone?
Is there something I can ask?
Is there a question she can ask?
Yeah.
If you could just shed some light on,
Okay.
trying not to make it long, but there's 2 points that are interest me. One is, will majority of people a lot of people within the city that buy properties, sometimes they're small businesses because they don't want to deal with giving rent, right? Now, if we look at Jackson Heights, it was, big property owners came in, started buying smaller properties because they have a plan for making a huge commercial building. So they buy up smaller properties. If this was to go into effect, how would that big landlord, would he be able to accomplish what they're currently accomplishing? And the second thing is, where this is already taking place, like I've already mentioned that in Pakistan, you get a lease. But one thing that I've noticed there is that unless you own that property and then thereby own a business within it, the incentive for repairs and renovations become less a priority for the owner. So if this was to come into effect, how would that affect the incentive for repairs and renovations in a property? Because right now they know to stay in the competitive market, they have to keep on renovating the property to keep it up to par. It's not only for aesthetics, it's for safety reasons, but and it helps businesses too. But unless it's like some type of franchise business that has a code that you have to follow, renovations, they're just small businesses on their own. Where does that personal initiative come if the competitive side of things would dull out a bit? That's the one thing that if you can shed some light upon how, if this was to go into effect, how would that change? Because where there are currently this is happening, this is something that I've noticed, that people just do not make the repairs and the renovations on time. But where I saw that they tend to is if they also have a business along with owning that property, because they know to attract the customer. So how do you believe that if this was to go into effect, how would that affect that part? And then also don't forget the first part of my question right now about Jackson Heights, how Jackson Heights changed. These big property owners came, bought out smaller properties because they have a plan, and then they got the city to agree to do zoning changes so that they can make, huge companies can come in because they would need an entire block, to bring in those stores. That how would that, would those types of, property owners be affected if this was to go into effect?
Yeah, this for the benefit of the microphone up there. So the idea of changing property taxes so we no longer tax the improvements
Right.
should relieve the problem of the not doing the improvements or the necessary repairs because you're not paying that extra tax. Because what Henry George School and Georgians in general try to do is say we
we need to only tax the land and relieve the burden on productive activities like labor and capitalism. So I think that'll address the problem of not,
No, but to that point, that's for commercial, can you take that for a second? That's for commercial property in, okay, so if you own the building, right, and you're making repairs and renovations on it because it's residential, that's not on the resident that's renting, that's on the owner to do that. Now, there's some.
it's the landlord.
Yeah, exactly, the landowner, but there's some properties, like commercial property, that you have to, through contract, fill a certain amount of repair, but for example, if a franchise business is on that property, they have the right in their contract to be able to do updates to, you know, be able to stay within the company. But what I'm saying is that that's working in our current system. It gives the incentive to keep up-to-date properties that don't look dilapidated. You know, unfortunately, I'm going to be very honest with you. I don't know if you guys remember, but there was an earthquake that happened in 2005 in Pakistan.
Yeah.
And a lot of these properties, like, because of that, you know, that incentive not being there, they were, if they were continually repaired and renovated properly on time, they wouldn't have had that massive of an effect on the building when the earthquake happened. Now, what I'm trying to say is that right now in the system, it's working in the cities because if you want to be part of the competitive market, you just have to continue to keep repairs and renovations on your property. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to rent it off, you know? But where does it fall if no longer that initiative isn't there? Like, so you're not going to be taxed for repairs and renovations. Does that then still will people, I mean, will this flush out eventually? People just won't care to buy properties anymore because they won't see a benefit in purchasing property? If all of, you know, the tax is going to end up landing on them. I mean, I just want to, if you could shed some light on that aspect of it, because where I'm seeing this already in place, this is the one hiccup that, how would we address it here? Whereas maybe in those countries they're not able to address it because they do this idea of leasing out. You know that the actual ground isn't yours, but the building is yours, you know? So how would we be able to do this, and will we, if this was in effect, would Jackson Heights even have changed? You know, that's one of the things that if land value tax was in effect, small businesses would be thriving. That cultural richness that's in Jackson Heights wouldn't have been, you know, lost. So I'm wondering that, so that probably is not plausible. And would then those big companies that need those big spaces that hire a lot of people, I mean, I don't know what they're going to hire in the next 10, 20 years, maybe they'll have robots doing the work, but, you know, for this, right now they employ people, right? So it's not such a big it's not, in one point you're like, okay, they'll employ people, so if the neighborhood changed so drastically, it's not a complete, there's still some silver lining to this. Even if other people lost out the opportunity, there's still some type of sort of balance you're seeing. So I'm just like wondering, like, if this was in effect, probably Jackson Heights would not have changed. And so do big businesses get affected then because they're not able to get the huge amounts of lots that they need in order to come in? And also just, you know, the human initiative, does it start lacking, you know, because of not wanting to put money back into repairs and renovation? You know, that's the only thing. Right now we have it because you're competing to get that, you're trying to get somebody to rent off of you versus somebody else because of how nice you renovated your place. But if things are just going to become so much more affordable, maybe people aren't going to care to put that much money back in renovation. You know, that's my only, you know, for somebody that, you know, cares and sees the benefit. When you live abroad, that's one of the things you miss. And it really frustrates you when you go into buildings, you're like, oh my God, you know, that the renovation, the repairs are just not kept up on time. It's very depressing.
Yeah, I think we might have to explore this
Yeah.
at another time, but there's a couple things I want to say with the things you brought up. Is that, you know, we don't live in a system where land value capture is in full effect. And what happens is you know, when the politicians and the power brokers allow the accumulation of these properties for a big development, you know, I guess the profits are already figured out way in advance, and
Yeah.
they're doing the zoning. And
Feasibility
that's-
study.
You know, that's the perks you get when you're in the system. But, you know, what's going on in Manhattan generally is that there's this growth of these luxury high-rises. And we know that the cumulative add-on effect is that they're running out the small businesses, the mom and pop, historic, you know, what made New York attractive. So if everything goes the way that it's going to go, is that everybody's going to be looking for the effect of New York, and it won't be there because it's already been run out. So that might be the platform we run on as.
No, but the question is, who pays for the renovations if we go with the Henry George plan?
Like right now, you get penalized, right? So,
Yeah, who pays? I
because
mean,
the assessment happens.
because I don't own the land. So, you know, any improvements,
Oh, okay.
yeah, so that's the question.
Well, see, Henry George never said that you can't own the land. What the single tax is all about is kind of like the value from it. So, you know, nobody's going to station military on your property. You know, that's but and he mentioned this several times in the writings that ownership, you know, it's a value to me. It's kind of like a fee for being in the city. So, who the entity that takes care of the maintenance and such, it would be by the company or the capitalist who's on that piece of property, and if they don't have the wherewithal to be successful, then somebody else will come in. That's the short answer on it. Is that,
I'm just looking at the current structure we're living in and seeing that if this does get into effect, because we have, it's not only just, you know, it's not the idea of only monopolies. Businesses are in America in various ways. They're through franchise, they're through, you know, being part of corporations and stuff, and then there's just completely, you know, mom and pop, you started from scratch, you know, and you took a loan from the bank, and you came up with it. I'm just thinking about these various ways in which how businesses are run on these properties. Like, where will that, you know, be lacking? But yeah, if you can,
okay,
you know,
appreciate the question, and thanks for coming.
Thank
See you in 2
you.
weeks.
Okay, Marty, take care.
Okay, see ya. And I'd like to thank everybody who's still on the YouTube. We're closing down now. It's 8:44. Thanks for watching. And join us again in 2 weeks on November 14th, 6:30 p.m. Thanks.
You should turn that off now, Marty, the taping.
Yeah, I don't know how to do it.
Abraham.
Let's see.
I think he's coming down. We'll need the background, not that.
Okay.
You did good, you did good.
Oh, thanks.
It takes, you know,
Yeah.
You
No,
should-
it was scheduled, no,
you gotta limit them to one question at a time, not.
Oh, yeah.
all at once.
Basically what she, yeah. So for the prep is a bit more, the one that really requires a bit of us. And if you can convince Rick to do some time away, just for 20 minutes on Saturday or any day on the day, that would be perfect. So we could meet over the weekend, and then we can talk to Lori to find a
Yeah, I don't
date
know.
on sometime